Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, December 4th, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about the Never Back Down PAC. Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor's super PAC that has been supporting him financially and in terms of logistics and event planning and messaging and strategy throughout the entirety of the presidential campaign, having a very significant shakeup in terms of top-level, highly important leadership that seems to suggest that the Never Back Down PAC is in fact backing down. Governor Ron DeSantis, who has been a very, very big name in the Republican primary for the 2024 race, has started to see a fluctuation in numbers that seems to show him going up and down between second and third place. Governor DeSantis, who was long seen as this giant Titan Slayer, the one who was going to take on Donald Trump and successfully win, has started to dwindle in terms of national support, resulting in people pulling out from his presidential campaign. Now, the 2024 Republican presidential nomination contest has always been Trump's to lose. But for a brief period of time back in May and April of 2023, just this year, Governor DeSantis and Donald Trump were in a closer position than they are today. At one point in time, too, Donald Trump's lead over Governor DeSantis was a margin of just 14.7%, according to Real Clear Politics. According to FiveThirtyEight, that margin was even closer. You can see that at different periods of time back in January of 2023, that sometimes the margin between the two was anywhere between 3 to 4 points. Today, that margin stands at a 50-point difference between Donald Trump and Governor DeSantis. You start to see here that President Trump, with 61.1% of the Republican primary vote here, has only continued to expand his lead. Now, Governor DeSantis is in a race between him and Ambassador Nikki Haley, 13.3% for Governor DeSantis, 10.2% for Ambassador Haley here, and you see that the difference is marginal, a difference that should not be marginal, given the amount of money backing Governor DeSantis, the amount of enthusiasm previously at least backing him as well, and the way that this strategy was originally supposed to be employed. Now, I think that Governor DeSantis for a long time, too, hasn't really seen the spotlight in the way that he does now. A lot of people attribute his unlikability to the reason as to why he is losing the presidential race. People can't really seem to understand how someone can go between 2 to 3 points of beating former President Trump, and then fast forward to the actual primary season upon announcing losing support nationwide. A lot of people on the DeSantis campaign were saying, just wait for Governor DeSantis to announce. Ron DeSantis will boost up in the polls following the announcement. And yet every single milestone that they said he was going to make improvements, the debate will be the game changer, the second debate will be the game changer, the endorsement from Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds will be the game changer in Iowa, nothing seems to be stopping Donald Trump. And it looks like in a very similar and very, I think, eerie way for Democrats, very similar to how it was back in 2016 when Donald Trump first announced his bid for the White House, except this time he always had the majority and is only continuing to expand it. And so what I also think and have come to understand around Governor DeSantis is that it doesn't seem to be his time to be someone who can beat Donald Trump in the presidential. What we have seen in 2024 data as well is that in the event that Donald Trump is taken out of the Republican nominating field, Ron DeSantis, more often than not, is the first place candidate. And while that might make sense to you because he's in second place, it actually seems to be a very significant chunk of Trump voters that say if Donald Trump is off of the ticket, Ron DeSantis is my next guy. It isn't Nikki Haley. It isn't Vivek Ramaswamy. It's certainly not Chris Christie. And Tim Scott's out of the race. Doug Burgum, too, and Asa Hutchinson, only a matter of days. We're narrowing up the field here, and voters are saying in the hypothetical, not this reality, but the hypothetical reality in which Donald Trump is out, I'm all in on Governor DeSantis. But between the two, there clearly is a choice here. Now, I mentioned Iowa talking about Governor Kim Reynolds because she endorsed Governor DeSantis. This was a very, very big piece of news, one that some Republicans thought might be able to change the trajectory of DeSantis' race. But I do believe he has a fundamental problem in that he is unlikable. Voters don't like him the more they see him. You've seen it happen in New Hampshire, which was supposed to be the state that solidified Ron DeSantis. In fact, the first poll that we've seen documented on Real Clear Politics here from the beginning of this year, January 2023, following the midterm elections, Ron DeSantis, according to the University of New Hampshire, was beating Donald Trump by 12 percentage points. By the next time, 3 months later, that they had the same poll with the University of New Hampshire, Trump was up by 20. And in the most recent poll from CNN and the University of New Hampshire, Donald Trump is up by 22 percentage points, contributing to the overall RCP average of Donald Trump leading by 27%. And never in Republican Party history has a candidate gone on to win both Iowa and New Hampshire, and then eventually the nomination. And Donald Trump very well could be the first. Ron DeSantis in the state of New Hampshire, too, has seen a collapse that seems to tell us why people are leaving his super PAC as well. This is the early stages of a dismantling presidential campaign, and the Iowa caucus hasn't even happened. Never Back Down populated back in 2022 when the governor's race went overwhelmingly to Governor DeSantis. What we found in Florida was that he was the one Republican who was able to take a state, often holding issues with competitive races here. Republicans barely winning. Trump won it by a point in 16. He won it by 3 in 20. Nothing was a deafening margin. Marco Rubio had the largest we had seen in quite some time with a 7-point margin back in 2016. Rick Scott won by less than half a point. Governor DeSantis, 4 years prior to this one, won by 0.4%. The race in Florida was so exceptionally close that it boiled down to a fraction of a percentage point. But then 4 years later, he's winning by 20 points against the former Republican governor of the state of Florida. I mean, think about how crazy it is. Not only is Charlie Crist a figure well known, but he's someone who has won a statewide elected position, this exact position, as a Republican. And so Charlie Crist, as the Democratic nominee, had been serving in the House for the Democratic Party. He ran for Senate as an independent statewide, won the governorship as a Republican. I mean, this guy was by far not certainly far from a nobody. This wasn't some sacrificial lamb propped up in Florida. He was someone who Democrats realistically thought could win. And so when Governor DeSantis wins by 20 points, and you have Governor Reynolds, too, in Iowa winning by 20 points, you expect these people to have similar mandates. And so looking back at what happened in the state of New Hampshire, the people backing Never Back Down probably were very excited after the midterms, probably expecting a lot to happen for Governor DeSantis. And now, not only is Governor DeSantis not winning in New Hampshire, polls again showed him just losing roughly by 12 points, 13 points in the state on average in April, just months ago, actually. You're talking 7-8 months ago from now. As time went on, not only did Ron DeSantis dip, but he started to drop below a number of other candidates. And as of right now, Ron DeSantis is losing to Nikki Haley, losing to Chris Christie, 0.7% above Vivek Ramaswamy. What happened to the state that supposedly was supposed to love him? Well, they met him, and that was his problem. His numbers aren't just dwindling in New Hampshire, too. I raised the thing about Iowa's governor election because it showed that Kim Reynolds, in more regards than not, had a mandate to go into the 2024 presidential election to sway the voters in Iowa, right? She was someone who had very much won over Iowa voters in a larger margin than Donald Trump had. She had been able to do what many Republicans thought was far from likely. She was able to have a landslide in the state of Iowa. Look at 2018. She also had a competitive race, winning by just 3 percentage points across the state. So when you see Iowa in 2018, fast forward to 2022, Kim Reynolds, very well liked, adored, etc., endorsing Governor DeSantis, you find that Iowa, realistically in old politics, should have shifted quite a bit. But not only did it not shift in favor of DeSantis, it didn't shift at all. Voters don't care that Ron DeSantis was endorsed by Kim Reynolds. Voters here also very much like Nikki Haley. And with Tim Scott's departure from the presidential race, with the departure of Doug Burgum, who's at 2.7%, these margins may not seem to matter. These percentages may not seem to matter because they're so small. But they could actually prop up someone like Nikki Haley to second place. Prop up Nikki Haley to even a close position between her and DeSantis, and that would be cataclysmic. Because DeSantis' whole thing is that it's a two-way race between him and Trump. What happens when he's ranked third? What happens when he's no longer in the top two? Everything falls apart. And so people are jumping ship early. It's an early indication that this primary season is practically over, with not people withdrawing from the race time after time, with governors endorsing candidates that aren't anyone but Trump, right? You see Donald Trump reeling in major endorsements, getting one from Greg Abbott in the state of Texas, getting one from Christine Noem in the state of South Dakota, pulling in top Republican officials across the United States. Kim Reynolds is unique in that she is endorsing a losing candidate in the state of Iowa, and her endorsement seems to have had no impact. With the average here of Donald Trump up by 29.7%, there does not seem to be a reality in which that come next month, when the Iowa caucus begin, that Ron DeSantis wins. I know there are a lot of Republicans out there on the DeSantis campaign that think he can somehow turn this around in the final month. I'm here to say that simply will not happen, and that Donald Trump, besides any potential court intervention, will be the Republican nominee for president. And that's exactly what all of these major officials in the Never Back Down PAC understand, is that Ron DeSantis is a losing candidate, that he is on his way out, and that Donald Trump is back on his way in. Now, for the general election, that's a different conversation, but it still absolutely matters. And I think the more that we start to see even the media discuss the fact that there is a closer race between DeSantis, between Haley, it makes it even more difficult for us to see how he has a pathway forward. With the fourth debate stage taking place just this week, actually, it's going to be taking place on Wednesday night at the University of Alabama. There will be a few candidates that will qualify. I imagine Governor DeSantis will qualify. I imagine that Nikki Haley has qualified. Vivek Ramaswamy has qualified. Chris Christie claims to have qualified. Tim Scott has pulled himself out of the presidential race. Doug Burgum has also pulled himself out of the presidential race. There aren't really that many people left for the debate stage, but it would all likely be just for viewing pleasure rather than any type of substantive change, because no one is watching these without Donald Trump. No one is paying attention to the GOP side unless it is involving President Trump. And that is the barrier for entry for a lot of these candidates here, that even if they are making brilliant points at the debate, even if they are appealing to their base or another person's base effectively, if people aren't watching, the impact is zero. And I honestly do think, watching a few of the recent ones, watching the past three, there have not been ones that I think have been game changers for any candidates except for minor bumps for one person, and it isn't Governor DeSantis, it's Ambassador Nikki Haley, who seems to be making minimal improvements, but enough to potentially put her in a position where she wins second place. And just taking a look at these really early states again, the national numbers actually show a better story for Ron DeSantis than the statewide numbers do, because in Iowa, he's neck and neck with Nikki Haley. In New Hampshire, very obviously, he's losing to Chris Christie and Nikki Haley in single digits in the state of New Hampshire. In South Carolina, he's losing quite tremendously. Nikki Haley at 18.8%. Tim Scott was at 9%, almost beat Ron DeSantis here, but it seems as if that will shove over to Nikki Haley's, spot here. She will be that second place candidate in South Carolina as of right now. And in Nevada, this is the only place where you really see Ron DeSantis in second place, the last poll being done in August and October. Not a lot of interesting things going on around here. People aren't really focused on the Nevada presidential caucus, but by the time we go through these first three, there's a realistic shot that Nikki Haley, in fact, is in the second place position nationwide, which only shows further how Ron DeSantis' campaign has continued to fall apart nationwide. On the last part here, I want to briefly take a look at the general election between the potential Republican candidates and Joe Biden. We see here, let's just see if we can find some general election data. Donald Trump does beat Joe Biden in a head-to-head matchup, and also a huge worry sign that I think that Ron DeSantis needs to face too is that pollsters aren't polling him versus Biden. There are more now recently Haley versus Biden polls than there are DeSantis versus Biden, which means that these polling companies don't even think they should be spending money on fielding questions around his candidacy, because they do not see him as a viable candidate anymore. And so I think that's something that should also terrify him too, is that if the pollsters don't care, the voters don't either. And it's not, a direct correlation. Obviously, they're not looking to the pollsters to who to vote for, but it's a general indication that if the voters aren't as enthusiastic around him, he probably isn't going to get the nomination, and is there a purpose behind it? But in the polls where we do see Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis Joe Biden and Ron DeSantis facing off against each other, I want to take a look at the difference between DeSantis' performance and Donald Trump's performance, because I think the difference here might actually shock you. On one hand of things, I think we can even see it recently. Donald Trump wins by 1.7%. In a DeSantis v. Biden matchup, DeSantis wins by 0.8%. Although Ron DeSantis was touted by many as the more electable candidate, it is clear here that there seems to be voters out there that would vote for Trump over Biden, but Biden over DeSantis. And while that might have been a different story 6 months ago, a year ago, quite honestly, This is the story of today, and the reason why Ron DeSantis, should he even make it to the general election, might not in fact be the more electable candidate as he somehow promised and was supposed to be the Titan Slayer who took on Donald Trump, won the general election against Joe Biden, to now faltering across numerous early states to a point where his super PAC is collapsing alongside his campaign. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Republican primary election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.